always try to think ahead on third Sunday of the month singing night about what I'm going to talk about. I'm the designated talker on singing night, and sometimes it's easy to come up with sometimes I have no problem coming up with something to talk about because it's been something on my mind or somebody asked me something or whatever. And then other times I'm kind of right down to the wire and I still really don't know what I'm going to talk about. Well, this one wasn't quite down to the wire, but it was a question that came up a couple of days ago. And so I thought I would try to give it a little bit of effort. It's one of those stories that there's no way to really explain the whole thing in a short lesson. It deserves quite a bit longer than that because, as some things do. But the question came up about this episode in the life of Jacob about when he wrestled with, somebody all night long. We start out with Jacob had a unique relationship with God. Wasn't really marked necessarily by faith like Abraham's or by a lot of persecution in his life that happened to Joseph or even leadership like happened to Moses. His relationship seemed to be very personal with God, but not in the way those others were. He seemed to always struggle as a young man. Even his father preferred his brother. And so Jacob was always, seemed like he was getting himself into trouble. Now, again, the Bible doesn't give us every detail of every day of his life, but it seems like he was always a problem. For starters, his name, as we remember a little bit of that story, either means a deceiver or it means a supplanter, someone who takes the place of somebody else, somebody who tricks people. That's from Genesis 25. And he, as we know, he obtained so he was named that when he was born. I don't know if that would be a name you'd want to be known as in first grade or what, but he was called that. And he got his blessing from his father by deceiving him, because again, his father was expected to and should have given his blessing to his brother Esau and thought he was. So it wasn't some last minute thing where he changed his mind. Jacob deceived his father in Genesis 27. And of course, Esau is not happy about that. He's hunted down more or less by his brother, and who vows to kill him in Genesis 27 because of that. Again, I'm skipping over some parts of the story to get to another point. But, Jacob has to run away. And so he winds up going to his uncle Laban's house. And over a period of more than 14 years, he winds up marrying two of Laban's daughters. Again, the same thing happens to Jacob that he's been guilty of. Laban tricks him, deceives him, and he labors for 7 years to marry the daughter Rachel and discovers when it's too late that he's actually married the older sister Leah, who he didn't want to marry, and so then winds up laboring 7 more years in order to marry Rachel. Anyway, that's another part of the story, but it shows that I guess what goes around comes around. He had tricked his family numerous times, and he winds up in the same position. So his uncle deceives him, and so he has to run for his life again, so to speak, because again, I'm skipping over parts of the story, but he has to run and leave him, and then he winds up having to go back and worry about his brother who's threatened to kill him one day. So Jacob has a lot of things going against him, and if you read through more of this around chapters 27 through 32 or so, you can read how he's referring to God. Genesis 28:13, he says, "The Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac." And then in Genesis 31, he says, "If the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac." And in Genesis 32, Jacob says, "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac." He doesn't say my God. He calls him the God of his ancestors, who he fears and all that, but he's not got this closeness with God because he's had a rough life, some of which he's caused himself. It looks like the relationship between God and Jacob always centers around Jacob's ancestors. But then you see this incident happen with this, some call it the angel of God, some call it Jesus appearing in the Old Covenant, in the Old Testament, at the Old Testament times. And then some are a little unsure. But whatever he's wrestling with all night is a being that's much more powerful than he is. And regardless of what different people believe or think that being is, he is much more powerful than Jacob is. And then what you see from then on is that he talks about in Genesis 32, he talks about God in a different manner after that. So Jacob, if we look at that in Genesis 32, 24 through 30, let me get to there. 32, 24 through 30, it says, and again, I'm not telling you the whole story, it would take quite a bit of time, but Jacob is left alone in verse 24, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he could not prevail against Jacob, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and Jacob's thigh was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no more be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Tell me, I pray, your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." Well, again, there's different places in the Bible where we are told that no one sees God face to face, that Moses was the only one that came close to that. But when we look at this story, we see that what Jacob realizes as this has gone on is that he has been in the presence of God, whether that's literally God, literally Jesus, literally an angel. Again, depending on what you look at, you could discuss that at length. But it is a heavenly being, because at the end of that is, I have seen God. And his whole attitude of life seems to change there. It almost seems like this wrestling going on, because it's I think impossible to imagine that Jacob as a human being would be stronger than or as strong as an angel from God, whatever that being from heaven is. And so it seems like that the wrestling match, the straining and the striving throughout the night, was almost like when we think of when we see a person who is trying to break a horse. The horse is resistant and resistant and resistant, and the man is persistent and persistent and persistent, and finally the horse gives up and says, "I have had enough and I can't do more." That seems to be, in my way of reading this, what's happened with Jacob. He is fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting, and the person who is fighting back is resisting to the degree that Jacob is exerting himself. Not that he is weaker than Jacob, but that he is letting Jacob wear himself out. And finally, he gets to a point where he clings to this being and asks for a blessing. Not that he's fighting an enemy, but is asking to be blessed. And the name that he's given his name is changed from a deceiver or a supplanter or one who is trying to get away with something to Israel, which is equivalent to the saying that he has striven with God and man and has prevailed. He fought against men and tried to win, and sometimes did and sometimes didn't. He has struggled with God, but now he has realized his position, and now he responds by naming that place Peniel, which, depending on, again, the translation could mean soul or my deep inner being. It's not until after he reunites with Esau the next day that his fear about Esau goes away. And there he builds an altar to God by the name of, and it's El Elohai Israel, or Mighty God of Israel. Previous to that struggle, Jacob had always referred to God in terms of his ancestors. He always said it was the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, but not any closer than that. Now he calls God the Mighty God of Israel, or, since his name is Israel, the Mighty God of me, or my God, my mighty God. He no longer thinks about God as being a loving God of some of his family, but as his own now. There's evidence that this stuck. In Genesis 35:3, Jacob, Israel, wants to go to Bethel to erect another altar to God, who answered him in the day of my distress and has been with me wherever I have gone. And later on his deathbed in Genesis 48, Jacob calls God his shepherd all of his life to this day. So what lesson is that for us? Sometimes we struggle with God. Sometimes we struggle with ourselves. Sometimes we're not as honest and ethical as we ought to be. Sometimes we are. But in this particular case with Jacob, God had a plan. Jacob resisted that in many ways through a lot of years and a lot of trying to do things on his own. And it took God some extreme measures, we'll say, for Jacob to come around where God could call him or rename him Israel, to then trust God with all of his might. We need to trust God, and hopefully without all of that struggle that he went through. We do struggle at times, especially when we're young and independent and think we're stronger than anybody else or tougher than anybody else, or we have a better idea than anybody else. And at some time along the way, we begin to realize maybe that's not quite true. And we then hopefully find a way, others help us find a way to become trusting in God, as Jacob did after he fought himself to exhaustion, so to speak. He finally realized that that wasn't getting him anyplace. And so we need to trust God without all of that struggle that he went through. Let's try to do that. Let's think on these things while we stand and sing.
To live for Jesus and be always pure and good. Would you walk with him within the narrow road? Would you have him bear your burden, carry all your load? Let him have his way with thee. His power can make you what you ought to be. His blood can cleanse your heart and make you free. His love can fill your soul, and you will see 'twas best for him to have his way